because most of your tanks were not in the armored divisions. They were in independent tank battalions that were attached to the infantry division supporting the infantry. 1 to 2 battalions per infantry division. And then we had, I talked earlier about the 105 proposal that didn't take place. Mobility improvements. We went to a standardized engine. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you talk about the lethalness of it. How did the flamethrower concept work with a tank? How did that get into the tank, and how did it protect against it?
The flamethrower was designed for the Pacific because those dastardly Japanese would be dug in and hard to get out. And the Marines needed, and the Army too, needed a lot of firepower. And the idea was some of these bunkers were hard to get to by infantrymen because they get shot getting there. So the idea is you drive a tank up to it and squirt the flame into it. So there were a couple ways they did it. One was either through the barrel, and they redesigned the barrel, and it used a high pressurized gas, and what it did was it pushed it was like a napalm, liquid, gel. It squirts out, and then there's an igniter that ignites it as it's going, so it's away from the tank. Another way was they put a tube alongside of the barrel, and they had that work. They had it work through. They were highly effective in the Pacific, and they were redesigned in Vietnam with the M48 tanks called the M6E7 Zippo. One of the big improvements, though, was to move away from the radial engine and go to an automotive engine, and they went to the Ford GA8 engine, which became the standard tank engine. It's a big V8 engine. I had it written down. It had 1,100 cubic inch displacement, and it was a 500 horsepower engine. For the Sherman, it was an extremely good engine. One of the problems was we put it in the M26 with a little bit of a manifold. It was called the GA something else, and it wasn't powerful enough, but it was great for the Sherman. It made for a better ride because you don't have this big thing spinning in the back of your tank.
So, just a quick question is, logistically, this would be a nightmare trying to keep up with all these versions out there. Were the earlier versions just killed off?
Nope. I mean, we produced radial engine tanks right to the end of the war.
I mean, not just that, but all the other,
most of your components were common. Your suspension system was all the same. The drivetrain was the same. The internal components, the radios, all that was the same. Really, the only differences was in the hull shape and then the engine. So what they tried to do is they tried to have A1 tanks in one battalion, A3 tanks in another battalion, so the parts flow would go to that. But by the end of the war, you will see tank battalions with M4s, M4A1s, M4A3s, HVSS tanks, VVS tanks, because that's how the replacement system goes. And you know what? We managed to repair them all. As a matter of fact, it's one of the things we'll talk about. The operational readiness rate of the Sherman was the best of all tanks in the war. Absolutely best. The threat, the bad guys. Let's talk about them. That's what this is all about. Keep in mind that tank technology changed rapidly. You go from a standard 37mm gun in 1939. Every Army used a 37mm gun or its equivalent as its main tank gun. By the end of the war, you have 90 and 88mm guns as your standard tank guns, and 105s were on the horizon. We were developing a 155mm gun tank called the T-30. There's one at Tacom when you go in after you go in the main gate. It's sitting there. Huge gun. That was designed to kill the King Tiger originally, and then the JS-3 when we decided we were going to have to fight the Soviets. I'm going to say it. This German tank superiority that we all talk about, those Tigers and those Panthers, in my mind it was a myth. They were not the greatest tanks in the world, and there was a lot of reasons why. Number one, there wasn't enough of them.
They broke down a lot too.
Yes, the Panther had a terrible, the Panther when it first came out in 1943 would catch on fire. It started up catch on fire. And it had transmission problems right to the end of the war that they never could solve. They put a transmission in that could not carry the weight of that tank. And it, maintenance nightmares. Here's the thing. If I need to get 50 tanks 100 miles, and 50 show up, and the other guy starts with 50 and only 30 show up, who's got an advantage? That's what happened. The Germans had to move operationally by rail. They couldn't afford to move their tanks over long distances. They had to put them on trains and move them or they would break down. We could. For example, when the 100-mile road march from when Patton was going this way, and then he decided to go 100 miles that way to relieve Bastogne. Almost all the Shermans made it. I'd rather have stuff show up on the battlefield.
Did they not produce as many tanks as those small versions?
No, they did not produce as many.
Other question?
Not even close.
You know, you talked about the German tank security was a myth, but to the tankers, every German tank was a Tiger.
Every German tank was a Tiger.
Yes.
Yes. How many Tigers were made?
1,800.
Yeah, 1,067 thereabouts. We made it to the battlefield. 50,000 Shermans. 85,000 T-34 models of various types were made by the Russians. The Russians produced the most tanks. No, the Germans didn't have enough. Here's one of the things. You're fighting across, how long was the front in Russia? It was 800 miles long. It was 400 and some miles long on the Western Front. The Germans could not cover that with enough armor. So what? So what if they had big heavy tank battalions? You don't fight where the big heavy tank battalions are, you go around them. That's what was the problem. We could find a weakness in their lines with our numerical superiority and exploit it. The Germans couldn't cover it. One thing to remember, the Germans were developing tanks to fight where?
On flat ground.
In where?
In Russia.
In Russia. Russia was driving everything of their tank fight. And their tank fights, there were tank fights out to 1,800 meters in the steppes where it's nothing but grass. You know, it's like going out to North Dakota, see for miles. That's what they were developing. That's why the long tank guns, that's why the great optics, it's all those things. But on the West Front, the average tank engagement was 400 to 500 meters because of fog. You ever been to Western Europe in spring and fall? It's foggy most of the day. There's a lot of reasons why the tank engagement was lower. When a tank engagement is lower, you don't need that tank to go out. How many people saw Fury? Remember the great tank scene where the tanks charge at each other? You know, that Tiger tank came, he was a dummy. You know why he was a dummy? Because he could outrange that Sherman tank. When the Shermans were in, Brad Pitt wasn't a great tank commander either, because he fired smoke at the Tiger, right? Now, if I was a Tiger commander, I would have used that smoke. I would have went backwards to the next hill and been at long range and picked all 4 of those Shermans off, because he had the capability of doing it. That whole scene was stupid, okay? Also in our doctrine, as I talked about earlier, we were supporting infantry, and in the Pacific, the Sherman tank was the best thing ever, because the Japanese had nothing close. Nothing. They were stuck in the 1930s in their tank technology, and they rarely employed. The only real tank-on-tank battle was on Okinawa. And the Shermans were brutal. The biggest problem in the Pacific was Japanese guys diving on the tank with a bunch of explosive on it and setting it off. The Marines ended up putting welding spikes all on their tanks because of it. Another problem was anti-tank mines, but the U.S. Army said that, you know what, we're not going to worry about anti-tank mines as far as a tank is concerned. That's the job of the combat engineers. Because you have to put a lot of weight on the bottom of the tank in order to protect the mine. We dealt with that in Afghanistan and Iraq, a huge problem. Or you have to raise the vehicle up real high, and you just can't afford to do that. And plus, at a war of maneuver, once it maneuvers, mines drop off as a threat.
You mentioned that word, fury. Most people have seen. When they blows the turret off that Sherman tank, would the 88 millimeter have had the velocity to do that?
Anything would have the velocity that penetrates, but those didn't happen. The blowing off of the turret was Hollywood dramatics. That rarely happened. You see there's the famous picture of the Sherman turret in the desert where it's sticking in the turret ring, barrel down. I believe that was destroyed by engineers. They put explosives in it so that it couldn't be captured. okay? It takes a lot to move that. The only tank that does that, there is a tank that does that, it's the T-72 that the Russians do, because they have all their ammunition in the turret ring on an auto-loader, because they don't have a loader. The tank does it itself, okay? It has a machine that picks it up and loads the thing. It's supposed to be real fast, real cool, right? But that whole turret ring has got ammunition. These are 125 millimeter. It's that big. And when they get penetrated, that thing goes flying in the air because they all go off at once, okay? But,
You could pick up rocket motors.
no, the Fury had a lot of Hollywood in it. All right, this is the standard German-made battle tank in the early part of the war all the way up to 1943. It was a pretty good tank, actually, for its time. Fast, maneuverable. Originally, it gunned with a 37. When they gunned it up to a 50 millimeter, the British got a little worried. There was even 75s later on in the war.
Were they also, the turret and the hull, were they also welded, constructed?
Yes.
So, in our Sherman tank was welded, constructed, hull and turret?
No, turret was cast.
Casting, okay.
And the M4A1s were
The
cast.
M48s, the M60, the hull and turrets, the hull turned out to be casting also.
They were cast, they were also cast.
So what decided that?
On the development of the M47 and M48, I do not know. Okay. I think maybe for rolled homogeneous armor, you can get better armor if it's done perfectly. You can get really good, consistent armor. But as we go to space and special armor, what we do now, you don't need castings. You need only welding. Because now it's not a bunch of steel. Inside that frontal part of an Abrams tank is stuff that we can't talk about. And it's modular. You can actually pull it out, put it in, pull it out. Make it better, put that in. Notice the number built. This was their main battle tank in 1943. Panzer IV was originally an infantry support tank. It had a stubby little gun. It was pretty good at supporting infantry, and in close range it could deal with armor. It ended up becoming a mainstay tank as they upgunned it throughout the war, made it a little better. Pretty good tank, actually, but by 44 and 45 it was quite obsolete. But they produced them up right to the very end of the war.
Right.
Yes?
Would you say that the Stug with its long barrel 75 and almost 15,000 build would be a better match than
We will talk about that.
a couple of these?
That's a very good point, and I like you because of that. Because I personally believe, in 1944, the Germans should have stopped all tank production and produced only Stug IIIs. Because it was an excellent defensive tank. But we'll talk about it when I get to it. Because you could probably produce 1.5 to 2 of them per Panther, maybe even 3. The Panther took a lot of steel, took a lot of effort. By the way, Tigers were hand-built. They did not move down a production line. The specialist came to them. That's why there weren't that many built. They were built just like a Mercedes. That's not good in a war of industrial attrition. I personally believe World War II was not a war of maneuver. It was a war of strategic industrial attrition, and the United States reigned supreme throughout the whole war because of that. The Panther. In design terms, the Panther was an excellent tank. In actuality, it had a lot of shortcomings because it was put into production without testing too quick because of necessity. It was a hard tank to fight. It was a very extremely hard tank to maintain, and tank maintenance is everything. If you can't keep them running, you can't fight them. And that was a problem with this tank throughout the entire war.
I got a question for you. The 120 millimeter on that one, I noticed that there's not a bore evacuator in about the middle of the barrel.
That's a 75 millimeter.
That's a 75 there?
Yes, it's a very long 75. It was the longest 70. As a matter of fact, this gun is technically better than the 88. It was faster. It could penetrate a little bit more armor. It was a brutal thing to get hit by. In concept, this was a great tank. In practicality, it was a tough tank to keep going. The French actually used these up until 1949. They had 2 battalions of them because they captured them and they kept them going. But and they were a great tank. Does anybody know what it was a response to?
T-34?
Yes, it was when the T-34 showed up in 1941, it surprised the Germans. The Germans' intelligence didn't even know it was out there. And suddenly it showed up on the battlefield. Thankfully for the Germans, Russians weren't smart enough to put radios in all of them, so they couldn't command and control them very well. But this tank was a direct response. It was they captured T-34s, they sent them back, and they designed this tank as a result. It was a very good tank, but again, 6,000. You know, it's when you're running out of steel. Some of us were talking before everybody got here. By the end of the war, a round could hit one of these turrets and it would shatter because they were running out of molybdenum and the steel was very brittle. It would survive that hit, but it ain't surviving the next one because now the armor's been compromised. Tough to produce, tough to maintain. Probably a real good idea that was too late. And one of the problems was the Germans were kind of the mentality that best is better. We were good enough. Good enough in lots of them. They always wanted a better tank. And if you get into the problems of German war production overall, they were running out of steel. Most of their production was going to aircraft because of the air defense they had to do. Ammunition was eating up their budget. They were going broke. All kinds of problems throughout the war. It was a completely mismanaged production system. The Tiger, the vaunted Tiger, 1347 made. Heavy tank. Yes, if you ran into it, it was a problem. The Sherman could kill it, especially on the sides. All German tank had weak side armor and weak side armor on the turrets because they put a lot of their weight forward, which makes sense. Yes?
No, I thought it was the rear, as they said in the movie Kelly's Carols. He hit it in the rear. They didn't use the word rear, but they always said hit it in the back.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, we could knock out the engine, but these could, Sherman could kill this on the side. And under 400 meters, with the 76, it could kill from the front. So you got them close. You use your numbers, you use your air power, you use your combined arms, you used artillery. The artillery on the defense position, they have to close their hatches. If anybody's been inside a closed up tank and tried to see, you don't see very well, do you? You're looking through armored glass that's that big.
A blown-up tank is a dead tank.
Yeah. But only 1347, when the Americans have 50,000 Shermans and the Russians have 85,000 T-34s, I don't know. I don't know what this tank's going to do for you. The King Tiger. The King Tiger could have been the best tank of World War II. The problem was, by the time these things came out, they were huge. A lot of bridges couldn't support them, and the drivers didn't know how to drive them. How much training was a German tank driver getting in late 1944? He was getting a week of training. That included maintenance training, driving training. The gunnery crews were getting 2 rounds downrange. That was it. I mean, you can have the best tank in the world, but if you can't operate it, what good is it? You know, our training was going up, their training was declining. And what was another problem? What happened to the non-commissioned officers and junior officers of 1941 and 1942? They were taking dirt naps by now, okay? They're dead. So the expertise in the German army at the tactical level was being eroded severely. So by the time these tanks come out, most of these were found abandoned. The crews either ran out of gas or they got them stuck. Tank number 104 was found in a swamp. The British took it back and evaluated. I've been inside that tank. That tank's over in Royal Military College at Sherman, where I went for some courses on high explosive anti-tank rounds. And I got inside that tank, and then the sergeant major caught me and told me to get out of the tank. It's kind of cool. Okay, here it is, the Stug III. The Sturmgeschütz III was originally designed to be an infantry support tank. It was manned by artillery crews, and the idea was to have that low velocity, high explosives delivering 75mm gun, that little short 75 gun, in a small chassis, and they could parcel out 5 of them at a time to support infantry units. And it was an excellent tank. And then they got the bright idea, let's put the long 75 on it, make an anti-tank platform out of it, and it excelled at it. Especially in the defensive war fights in Normandy, in the Bocage, and all the way back to Germany, because it was very low to the ground. You'd fire, and it could back out because it was light. It was heavily armored up front. It was just as armored up front as the Mark IV, okay? So it could take a hit. If they could have produced a lot of these, would have won the war? No. But I think they would have been better off producing nothing but these tanks in 1944 and 1945.
Were they having a battle as far as design? Because you got that and the Panther, which are low silhouette, and then you got that King Tiger tank that stands out. I mean, it's huge. It's a
The Germans had a doctrine of offensive warfare, including in the defense. The German doctrine was if you were pushed off a position, you would automatically reorganize and counterattack. That's one reason why their infantry was slaughtered by 1944. And so the same mentality was in a tank. If you're advancing forward, you probably need a turret, you probably need more armor, and all those kinds of things. But in reality, what they were doing was falling back from position to position. So yes, there was a doctrinal problem. I don't think they grasped what this thing could have done for them. It was done as a substitute. I can't make enough tanks, so I'll equip battalions with these and send them out to kind of do the same role. Instead of developing a doctrine, go, you know what, maybe it's better we switch to it and learn to fight with them. I don't think they ever figured that out. This is a Fred Schwarz 50 years down the road kind of thinking, and this young man too is thinking the same thing. They're going to be a general someday, I can tell. Train out commander right there. So,
quick question. The Christie suspension allows you to drop the chassis lower as opposed to what we were using?
yes, the U.S. Army rejected Christie suspension as being too difficult to use the gun on the move, too hard to maintain. It rattles your tank. It makes your tank a tough platform. We rejected it.
Okay.
The Germans didn't use it. It looks like it's a Christie, but that's a cantilevered interspersed road wheel system with interspersed torsion bar systems. We ended up going to a torsion bar system with the M26 once we finally figured out how to do it. It's a tougher thing to do when you've got to drill and make your holes perfect to get that torsion bar through. It makes the tank harder to produce. Plus, we were already producing this suspension. We weren't going to stop mid-war. Okay, but we rejected Christie. The Russians adopted it. It was on the T-34. It was on. But at the end of the war, they no longer used it either. They went over to a torsion bar system with when they went to the T-44 and up.
KVs?
The KV did not use the Christie system. Theirs was more like the German system used here. The Germans had a plethora of their tank destroyers too. And this was another problem. They started developing way too many different vehicles, way too many different maintenance systems, gun systems, sighting systems, training systems, all those kinds of things. Some of these were nasty. The Jag Panzer IV was actually probably the best. It was extremely low to the ground, very heavily armored, and when they put the long Panther gun on it, it ended up being a fearsome vehicle, but they didn't produce many of them. And the Jag Tiger had this 150mm gun on it. The thing couldn't get out of its own way. They were designed to destroy the JS2 tanks. Very few of them made. The plethora of German anti-tank guns. The Germans actually were really good at anti-tank guns. We screwed up with ours. We used the small 37. My dad actually was a crewman on that in World War II. And then we went to the 57mm, which was the British 6-pounder. And then we went to the 3-inch. The gun was actually excellent, but we put it on an artillery platform. It was too high, and the crews were easily machine gunned because of it. The Germans built theirs very low to the ground and very maneuverable. The crew could, even the 75 pack could be moved by its crew. Now the 88, it was a big one. It couldn't be moved by them, but it was an excellent gun at long range, and they had them at the beginning of the war. But their doctrine was not to fight as anti-tank units. It was to disperse these throughout the infantry, and that's what made them more effective. The biggest problem throughout the war was what does that individual infantryman do when he's faced with a tank? Early in the war, he ran, because that was about the only thing he could do. Okay? The tank fright was huge early in the war because the infantrymen couldn't do anything with it. They did have these anti-tank rifles. They were like, 90 or 90 caliber, 50 caliber, up to 114 caliber guns. big, long rifles, hard to maneuver. The Russians used them all at the end of the war. They could get the light tanks, but they couldn't get heavy tanks. The Germans developed the excellent system called the Panzer IV. They had a black powder charge that fired this rocket out that had a shape charge warhead on it and could burn through any armor. The problem was, the first ones you had to be within 30 meters of the tank. You better hit them, okay? They ended up getting them out to 100 meters. They developed the Panzer Schreck after they saw our bazooka. Our bazooka was pretty good, but it wasn't big enough. It was 2.75, 75 inch. We ended up going to 3-inch later, right at the end of the war. But these were all excellent weapons. So in the cities and in the woods, you did not go near German infantry because they were going to kill your tank regardless. You had to go clear them out with other infantry.
But the Panzer IV, you only could use it once,
Yes.
correct?
Yes,
That was it.
it was issued as ammunition. By the way, the RPG-7 is a derivative of that weapon. It's the same exact concept. It's just it's reloadable. The Germans actually came up with, it's called the Panzer Faust 150. It looks like an early RPG. So the Russians stole the design. Okay. We're going to go in and look at threats. I always talk about most likely and most dangerous. So if you're a designer, you've got to figure out which one you want to counter, okay? Most likely is probably what you're going to see on the battlefield. This is in 1941. The Germans already had the 50 millimeter anti-tank gun. They had the Panzer Bush, that's one of those big rifles. It really couldn't do much to you. And the tank was a Panzer III. The most dangerous was the Panzer IV if you got within its range envelope, because it had the larger gun. There was no emerging tank. Down here at the bottom, I'll show you what's going on with the Sherman at this time. We are just now figuring out to build one, with the T6. 1942, we start production. We start seeing the emergence of the 75 millimeter anti-tank gun. Still the Panzer III is the mainstay tank, but now the Panzer IV is getting the longer 75, and it can now reach out and touch people. So it's emerging as a threat, and so is the Tiger. The Tiger shows up on the battlefield. Sherman production is now beginning and going full steam. 1943, the 75 millimeter anti-tank gun is the mainstay. The 88 is now emerging in a newer variant. You see the Panzer Schreck and the Panzer Faust starting to come out. The mainstay tank, the most likely one you're going to encounter is the Panzer IV, and either the G or H, both of the long 75. The Tiger one is the most dangerous, and the Panther is starting to show up on the battlefield. 1944, anti-tank gun is plateaued. We're not going to really see any improvement in it. Infantry anti-armor, the Panzer Faust is now coming out, and various is starting to get better, longer range, better weapon system. Now the most likely is the Stug III, because of the production. They're ramping up into production more. And the most dangerous is the Panther. The emerging is the King Tiger is starting to show up on the battlefield. What happens with the Sherman? We prove our operational ability by the rapid advance across France. The wet tanks are coming out, the 76 millimeter guns are coming out, and we're coming out with better suspension. 45. The Germans do come up with a 128 millimeter anti-tank gun. I'd like to manhandle that one. Again, the anti-tank gun is really the same. The Stug III is still the mainstay. The King Tiger is now the most dangerous. But we start seeing a change in what's new in tanks. We see night sights coming out. The Germans do develop a Panther tank with a night sight. It's a thermal imagery night sight. They do not field it. There's been rumors that the Russians actually might have engaged it, but there's never been any proof that that had happened. They also came out with a rifle that had a night sight on it. And what it is, you'd shine an infrared light out that you couldn't see with the naked eye, and you'd have the sight on that could see what it's illuminating. We used those all the way up to the 1970s. We put them on our tanks. But that's when we start seeing now a technological change starting to come into tanks. But the war ends, and that kind of stuff stops being made. Now, I know that was quick to go through it, but what that showed was how fast we went from 37 to 128 millimeter gun. how fast we went from the tank with a 50 millimeter gun to now fielding larger than 75s and 76 and 88s. That was just 4 years I took you through. Threats. This is the stoplight chart. If you see red, the tank will lose. Okay? Notice, at 500 meters range, the German tanks are just as vulnerable. So at the average tank range, the German tanks are just as vulnerable. Now this is done on what's called a V50 analysis. That means the shot has a 50% chance of penetrating, 50% chance of being stopped. That's the standard that we used in tank design. Sherman versus threats. Again, the only one that was invulnerable was the Tiger to the 75 millimeter, and then the Panther to the front. Everybody else was vulnerable to the 76 millimeter gun at the average tank range that we fought at. Okay, in my view, I think that the Sherman was the strategically most outstanding tank of World War II. It was very highly producible, and it was employed throughout the world. No other tank was employed throughout the world like the Sherman was. Now, people will say, oh, what about that T-34-85? Fast forward to Korea. No Sherman was lost to a T-34-85, but once the T-34-85s were lost to Shermans. Okay. Operationally, this is at the division, battalion, brigade level. The Sherman was an excellent tank because it could allow the commander that he could count on, if I need to move a large distance, the tanks were going to get there. That operational mobility was very important. It allowed us to do things like relieve Bastogne. It allowed us to break out in Cobra. It allowed us to do the raid on Hammelburg, even though that was a failure. It was still a 35-mile penetration in the German lines. Tactically, at the low level, tank on tank, platoon on platoon, it was an excellent tank, and that starts being eroded as the larger gun German tanks come out. That's just a fact of life. But it remained good enough to the end of the war. That's why we used them to the end of the war. Here's something I find interesting. U.S. Army Technical Intelligence was evaluating all the German stuff, and they did an excellent job of it. And they found out what its vulnerabilities are, what its strengths were, and everything. But what we didn't see, what I can't find in research, were they informing the Ordnance Department about this so the Ordnance Department could make decisions? I'm thinking that it was a time problem. The Ordnance Department goes, I got enough to do. You can tell me to go away.
Library will be closed in 15 minutes.
So that's what I think was happening. It just was a matter of time. Sherman improvements were reaction. We reacted to what was happening on the battlefield. That's just a fact of life.